Hello my friends, and welcome back to my painting channel. And today I'm painting a Blood Bowl star player, and this is KREEK Rustgouger. So this is a really cool sort of like half mechanical rat ogre kind of guy. If you're not familiar with KREEK, here he is. This is him all primed in my nice grey primer, and we're ready to paint him up. This is not so much a complicated, but this is quite a big paint job. So I'm going to put this into 3 different parts. I'm going to start with part 1, which is always, I normally always start with flesh. So if you followed my painting videos before, you'll know that I like to start with flesh tones. With this model especially, because of the size of the model and because of the amount of flesh that's on this model, I found it a lot easier to start by painting a lot of the flesh first and then building up to the details and things a little bit later. So I'll share with you my formula of how I painted this model, and if you want to join along you can. I'm using a lot of bellow paints because I tend to enjoy using a lot of the dropper bottles. I've collected a lot of bellow paints over the years, so I tend to use a lot of those, but you're more than welcome to use any sort of alternatives. If you're a Citadel fan or an Army Painter fan, there's normally an alternative paint for each and every one. So what I'm doing here is I'm starting with the bellow basic skin tone. You'll also have to bear with my pronunciation of certain things. Being from Wales, I don't tend to have the right pronunciation sometimes on certain things, so bear with me. You can always have a good laugh if I pronounce things wrong anyway. So starting with a basic skin tone here, a nice thin layers, so I used 2 thin layers of the base skin tone just to get this to the right consistency that I wanted, and I've covered all of the fleshy areas with this. This model, as I said earlier, does have a lot of flesh, so paying good attention to getting all of the flesh done first is a great way to go. So once I had covered all of the model in the basic flesh, then I've just added a little bit of bone white, which is a cream colour. So although it's called bone white, it's more of a cream texture. This is great for things like skeletons, bones, teeth, those sorts of things. So I'm just doing the nails, the claws, the teeth and things like that, just putting this basic colour on, because when we use the shade and the wash next, we're also going to cover this area and these parts in the same wash as well. And this will tie those colours together and help us out. Something else that is worth noting as well is when we tie in these colours together, because I've painted the model covering the whole flesh in sort of like one colour at the moment, what I'm also going to do is I'm just going to add this little bit of this bone white to the stitches that are holding the flesh together, and I'll show you that. I'll show you me doing that in just a second. And the reason for that is because it's just a slight tone difference at the moment, because we put in these sort of base coats on. Once the shade has gone on and we build the colours back up later, it'll tie those colours together a little bit better. If we use this all as just one colour and then go back in with a highlight later, the colours and the slight differences aren't going to be as noticeable. So what we're going to try and do is just put a little bit of bone white across these stitches, because when we paint those up a little bit later, they should sort of like stand out on the model and they should stand off the miniature a little better. So once you've done that, I'm just going to go in then and put the shade across this. So I'm just using an Army Painter flesh wash. Like I said, you don't have to use the exact paints that I do. If you want to use a Resin flesh shade instead, that's absolutely fine. They do the same sort of job. This is just my go-to flesh wash at the moment, because the consistency works well for me. That doesn't mean that it's the best, it just means that it is the one that I like using the most. So what I'm going to do is just cover across all of the miniature this way. And as you can see, I'm putting a nice healthy layer of shade onto this one. And it's one of my favourite things is covering a model in the wash, is because you get to see the wash sit in all those cracks, all those recesses, all those areas, all those hidden bits that sometimes you can lose a little bit when you paint in on the miniature. And the good thing with that is, because this sits in all of those cracks and all of those little grooves, it allows you then to build the colours back up in a much easier and a much neater way a little bit later. So as you can see, this is just sitting in between the teeth, just where the eye is, just across those little ridges across his nose as well. And this is fantastic because this is giving us a really good sort of platform to build the colours up and to build those highlights up from. So you don't have to be too precious at this stage, you don't have to be too precise, because as I say, we're going to build those colours back up anyway. So once all of that wash and all of that shade and everything has dried down, I'm then just going to go in and using thin we're using those thin sort of like layers that I was talking about in previous videos. We're going to use a thin down layer of the basic skin tone. So this is the colour that we used originally. So we're going from the basic skin tone, then into a shade, and then back to the basic skin tone. And what we're going to do is we're just going to avoid going around certain areas. So we're going to avoid like the stitches. We're going to try and leave little lines and little gaps when we paint in just around the muscle, just so that it creates that element of depth. Now you can build a lot of depth painting skin tones, and skin tones are really, really rewarding to paint. And when you've got a miniature like this that has so much skin tone on it, it gives you the opportunity to really paint, to really get like a really nice rewarding job. So once you finish painting all of this and you get this up to the level and up to the tone that you want, this would look really, really good, either on the tabletop when you're playing, or in your display cabinet, in your display case with the rest of his team. So you really want to spend a lot of time focus on the skin, because that's going to take most of the focus when people are looking at this miniature. They're going to look mostly at the skin first because of how much there is and how well it's done. So as you can see, I'm just leaving a few little gaps, a few little creases, just building this shade, just building this layer back up, just like so. And with it being thinner, so because I've thinned the paint down slightly, what we're getting is this is going to flow smoother onto that miniature. So the transition between sort of the shaded areas and the non-shaded areas is going to have a really nice transition. It's going to blend quite nicely, and it's not going to look too extreme. So what you're not going to end up with is, you don't want to end up with like going from a shade to a highlight straight in one go, and then you ended up with too much of an extreme. So we're painting this back in so that it blends nicely, it tones nicely, and it keeps a really good sort of even tone right the way through the miniature. As you see, I'm just mostly following the lines, and you can see where I'm just leaving little gaps here and there to create that element of depth, creating that element of folds and things like that. There you go, just like so, just across the knuckles, and then joining them across the back of his wrist and across his hand and things like that. And the whole idea, like I say, is all about building that depth. So you don't want just a flat colour on the skin, you want to build up that depth. And what we're going to do, because we want to build that depth up so much, and because the skin is such a prominent feature on this miniature, we're going to really spend a lot of time on building highlights and building multiple layers. So going back to the back, where you can see most of the skin and most of the way that I'm painting, try to be a little bit careful around the front side. Because of his arm, it does get a little bit in the way of around sort of his abdomen. But if you take your time, it's worth it. It's worth spending a little bit extra time and just building that up around the muscle tone on his abdomen as well. So what I'm doing then is I'm adding a little bit of a light flesh to this one. So I'm using the basic skin tone that we had before, and then I'm mixing about 50-50 of light flesh in with this. And the reason for that is we're boosting this as a slight highlight, but without boosting it too much. So this is sort of like an in-between highlight. Now, if you'd prefer and you want to spend more time on building the flesh, you can gradually increase this. So I'm using about a 50-50, but if you wanted to use less of that highlight and build up in stages and in tones, I mean, the more layers and the more tones that you build up, the more depth you should be able to get out of the skin. So yeah, it's completely up to you how many layers and how much you want to mix and things like that. But if you're following along, pretty much 50-50 is all I've used for this one. And as you can see, I'm going round again, and I'm just trying to catch the highlighted areas. And again, leaving some of the gaps and leaving some of the folds so that it creates that element of depth and that element of like his skin twisting and contorting and things like that. And as you see, I'm just using the very tip of my brush all the time as well, so it gives me complete control as to where I'm putting the paint. There's nothing worse than having too much paint right on the tip of your brush, popping it onto the miniature and finding that you've then got to try and manipulate or remove some of that paint. So just using the very edge, very tip of that brush, just to control where these brush strokes are going. And again, with it being thinned down as well, when that dries, it's going to have a really, really nice, more natural, more neutral blend into the miniature as well. So I'm just showing you on the back how I'm painting this skin tone, and I've done the same thing throughout the whole miniature, but I just leave that down to you guys then to build the rest and paint the rest of your miniature up and see how it goes. But just showing you on the back because this is the easiest area for me to show you kind of how I'm building that and how I'm using the brush to sort of build those highlights. So once that layer is dry, I'm then going back and doing a similar sort of thing, This time though, I'm only using just the light flesh on its own. I'm just trying to catch the very edges, just catch the very highlights, and this way then, so we've done, as you can see, we went from the basic skin tone, we went from the base coat, then to the shade, back to the base coat, then to a 50-50 highlight, and now to an exact specific highlight. And as I said, you can build that tone up on multiple layers if you want. You can do this through 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 layers and keep on building. But just for the purposes of this video and to make this look great but also be quite easy to do as well, I figured this many layers would be sufficient. This would be perfect. Something else that you can do if you really want the skin highlights to pop actually is, if you've seen some of my other videos and you've seen the way that I've painted sort of with inks, is if you add a very small amount of white ink into the highlight flesh, so into the light flesh here, that will give you a very light a very light highlight that dries down quite thin, but it also gives a lot of vibrancy to your colour as well. So if you wanted to go another step further and really paint sort of a highlight on that miniature, you can use that and use a little bit of ink as well. So that's the skin pretty much there. You know, we've done a few layers, that's pretty much all we want to do. So what I'm doing now is I'm just adding a purple wash into those creases where the skin looks like it's been stitched together. And the reason for that is because although we've used the flesh wash, I kind of want it to feel a little bit more bruised, a little bit more raw. You want that skin to be a little bit more sort of like a little bit more painful looking. So having it in a flesh wash, which is a little bit of a sort of like an orangey browny sort of tone or colour, you kind of want to use a little bit of the purple then just to create like a little bit of a bruised effect, or a little bit of like the skin is a little bit more raw. And what you can do as well, which I'll do a little bit later, is you can also add a little bit of a red wash to it as well. Now as I said, I'm using an army painter purple tone here, but you can use any sort of purple colour that you like. If you've got a purple wash, a favourite or anything like that, I think it's like the Droopy Violet from Citadel, that would do the same sort of job as well. That would be a perfect one. And as you see, I'm just tracing along those creases, just trying to add a little bit more sort of like bruising, a little bit more texture, a little bit more depth and grit to the model as well. So you're just following in and going around these areas here, just trying to add a little dot as well onto each edge of the stitches, just so that they tie themselves in a little bit as well, and they hold themselves, there you go, just around the edges and just around the sort of bruised area that we want as well. So this area, you want to try and be quite precise with this, because you don't want to just cover the whole miniature now in purple, so just try to be precise and getting into those gaps. So that was stage 1 all done. Now that we've finished the paint, and you can see that just across the scar there I've added a little bit more of the purple wash, just a very thin down layer. And from there we're just going to build up the details. So we're going to build up the details before we bring them back down and then highlight them again, similar to what we've done with the skin. So building up the details, what I'm using is a very dark brown first on all of the leathers. I'm using a dark rust, but you can use anything like a dryad bark or a well, anything along those sorts of lines, any kind of like really sort of like dark colour, dark brown that you can then build up later. And from there I'm also using a red. This is quite a deep red, this Vallejo red. This is a very basic red, but it is quite a deep red colour. And I'm just going to cover this across his little tabard across the front here. Just being careful around the back as well, because you can't see the tabard from the back, but it is quite awkward to get to. I'm just using it along the little bit of a ridge of the tabard just across the top here. From there as well, he does have a little bit of fur on him. Not a lot, but a little. So what I'm going to do with the fur that he does have, I'm just using a beastly brown with this one. This is a much lighter brown in comparison to the dark rust that I've used for the leather. And that's good, because when you're using sort of browns and using a model that has a few different sort of brown colours to it, it's good to have quite a contrast and quite a varying contrast of brown as well, because that will allow then your model to stand out in different ways. If we covered the fur as an example, the same colour as the belt, it would tie in too much and then you'd lose a little bit of that contrast. So I'm just covering the fur in a lighter brown, in that beastie brown. And once we've done that, I'm going to move on and paint the green areas, so the warpstone areas here. And using this, I'm going with a sick green for this. And sick green is a really good sort of base color green because it has quite a great tone to it. It's not too light, it's not too dark, it's a really good sort of middle of the road kind of green. So I'm just covering over all of the green areas here, just like so. So yeah, just covering over a lot of the green areas. Just gonna try to be a little bit gently adding a little bit of the green into the eye as well. This guy is so covered in warpstone, and this guy is running on warpstone, and I'm just kind of imagining his eyes glowing with the green as well. I mean, you could go with the complete opposite and add like red eyes in if you want them to stand out a little bit more, but I've opted for green this time. I'm just going to paint these warpstone pipes coming out of the back of his like steam engine on the back. I don't know what it is. Looks like a steam engine to me. He's got exhaust vents and all these different things. So I'm just adding the green across these cables, almost as if this is feeding the warpstone into his eye, his brain. I don't know, these sort of warpstone Skaven guys. They're pretty crazy. They're pretty wild. So like I was saying earlier with the purple, so we've used the purple tone and just gone across a little bit of the bruised area and around the bits of the skin that are all folded together. Now what I've done here is I've decided to water down a red tone. So I'm watering down a little bit of the shade just to add a little bit more depth around the area where it's all stapled together. Only because I felt like it needed a little bit more around that area. Now I've watered down a red tone from the Army Painter, but you could use something like a Caribou Crimson from Games Workshop, from Citadel, that would work fine. And just water it down so that it becomes a little bit more like a glaze rather than a wash. So we get in hints of that red, but not too much that it tones down all of the work that we've done on the skin. And I'm just being very, very gentle and very light going around that area as well. And as you can see, all of the green tones and all of the green areas are done just across his arm here, so just done his little warp stones that are coming out. And the good thing here is because of using this as a glaze, I can now sort of glaze a little bit around his skin to make it look a little bit more red and raw, like I was saying earlier with the purple that we were adding in. And with the red being such a contrast to the green as well, this should allow that green to stand out a little bit more, which is great. And as I said, just gentle glazing, so as you can see a hint of that red, but it's not shading down the miniature, it's not getting rid of the skin tones that we've worked so hard on. Now from there we're going to start adding some of the metals. Now metals on this particular guy, I've gone with true metallic metals. I'm more of a fan of true metallic metals than non-metallic metals. Again, that's not because one of them's better than another, it's purely based on personal choice. I just find true metallics easier to work with, they're a lot more forgiving. They don't take as long to do as well, which is great, but you can get some really great effects out of them. So I'm painting all of the silver bits first, and the silver bits are mostly sort of like his shoulder pads, but on the outer edge, around that sort of eye socket that he's got, that sort of like scouter kind of thing. If you're an old-fashioned DBZ guy, you know, he looks like a scouter. So we're just painting those bits up silver. I'm also going to paint the chain, his leg, his robot leg, I'm going to paint that silver. I'm going to paint his hand, because his right hand is a big metal claw, that's going to be silver as well. And we're going to paint certain little bits of the steam engine sticking out of the back of him silver too. And then what you can do then is you can sort of pick out some of the details with other sort of metallics. Now for me, I'm going with a brass. I'm going to use like a contrast between the brass and the silver to kind of make some of the details stand out a little bit more. And with this paint job, it follows a little bit of the box art, so it's a little bit similar to the box art. It's not exactly the same, but it is similar. So I'm just trying to use colours from a different paint range to what's on the box art to kind of create what the box art would look like if you use something else. So as you can see, I painted a lot of the silvers now, as I said, his hand, the chain, the ball, all these different things. And now I'm painting the tail. Now normally I would paint rat tails and Skaven tails quite bright, but this guy, because his skin tone is so bright, I opted to try to paint his tail quite dark so that it gives a good contrast again, because you don't want the whole thing to be really bright. So for this one I'm using a burnt red colour, so this is a really dark, toned down, sort of like really sort of rough dark red, and that's great because this is going to then contrast it completely against the skin tones, but it's also going to keep it a little bit of a different tone and a different red to his tabard, because again, as I was saying with the fur, you don't want to paint the same colours multiple times. You want to try and mix your shades so that you get different colours. And the reasoning for that is it just makes it a little bit more pleasing on the eye. It makes it a little bit more interesting to look at. So we're going to paint the front and back just to give you an idea as to what the colour will look like and how I'm painting and how much this model is sort of coming along by adding these details in now as well. You can see just how much this is progressing. Just want to try and be careful where the tail meets the fur and things like that, because as you get a little bit closer to the fur and a little bit closer to that area, it does get a little bit sort of it does get a little bit tight in there for you to get the paintbrush, so just be a little bit careful. I know they're only base coats, but the clearer and the more precise we are with the base coats means that it's less work for us to build up later, so it's better to spend a little bit more time making sure that you get things as clear and as tight and as sharp as possible. Now, as I said, I was going to use multiple sort of metals, so we're going from the silver. We're moving into the brassy brass, so as I said, I'm using a brass colour to just kind of pick out details. So for this we're using the brass to go right across the very edge, the inside edge of these shoulder pads, and then I'm also going to paint like the steam engine area and some of the exhaust vents and parts of these things in that brass as well. And that will give a little bit of a difference between where the silver is, where the brass is. It'll give you more for your eye to look at. It'll pick out on some of these details a lot better. So just painting that brass in and around this sort of warpstone heart, or this sort of warpstone area that he's got on his chest here. So just picking out these details as well. Just like so. And as I said, just painting some of that steam engine. I don't even know what it is, a warp fire engine, steam engine, I don't know. He's pretty wild, as I say, this guy. So just painting around that area there. And as I said, you're going to want to kind of pick out some details as well. So some of the rings around his tail, I've done silver. Some I'm also going to do brass, so again, gives you more for your eye to look at. The padlock, and then as you see, I've also done some of the rivets. So some of the little rounded areas on his leg, on his arm. And that's just to give your model a little bit of a different sort of look and a feel to it as well. So from there as well, we're just going to use that bone white again. We're just going to go across sort of these bandaged areas, these bits going across the leg. And we're going to use that bone white as well, just to pick out on any other sort of like detailed points. So things like the, as you see the inside leg here, we've got the bandage as well. And like I said earlier, we're going to try to be as careful as possible, because the clearer and the sharper that we can get these base colours, the better. But we also don't want to get these base colours then on the skin that we've worked so hard to build up. With that bone white as well, although we're doing the bandages, we're also going to want to just go across and do these tusks, do the sort of spikes that are sticking out of the left hand pauldron that he's got here, so just on his shoulder pad. There we go, and as I say, just trying to be careful not to get too much of this bone white across any of the silver. And once you've done all your base colours, the base coat should then look like this. So our skin is complete, and the base colours of everything else is just about there. So what we're going to try and do from there is we're going to use a different kind of wash. This one I have a sepia wash, which is a dipping formula. This is the Game Wash big sort of tub. This is a great wash. This dries down really nicely. It works with so many different colours, so it works really well for browns, silvers. It works great on the brass, you know, these sorts of colours. So I'm using this at the moment. It also dries down to a kind of like a really sort of soft tone, a really sort of soft effect, soft colour, and I'll show you that when it's dry in a moment. And I'm just going to go around the miniature now. I'm just going to build the shade up on the details that we've painted. Now this you've got to be careful with. So what we want to try and do is get those colours and get the shade into all those recess points on the detailed areas that we've painted. But by doing so, we're going to want to try our best not to let that shade get onto the skin that we've worked so hard for. Now you can get close to the skin and it'll tie those colours that we painted onto the skin as well. It'll tie them together quite nicely. But we don't want to let chunks of this or bits of this sit on that flesh, because we worked so hard on getting the flesh done. We don't want to ruin it all now by leaving a big chunk of wash or a big chunk of sepia wash left on the skin. So we're just going around, as I say, just going to try and catch all of the details. As you see, just being careful under the chin and around the face and areas like that as well. Just like so. And we're going to cover the whole, not the whole miniature, we're just going to cover all of the details that we've done. So the shoulder pads, the pauldrons, the machinery sticking out of his back, you know, all of the green bits as well, the tail, the fur. We're going to cover it all in this because this is going to tie all of those colours together. So yeah, this is a great wash to use, especially on the brass. I found this wash on the brass specifically, I found I didn't really have to do much rebuilding or much toning, bringing that tone and bringing the colours back up. I found that this particular sepia wash sat on the brass in such a way that I didn't really have to do a lot more to it, and I'll kind of show you that in a moment. I've sped this up as much as I can just to give you an idea as to me covering certain areas. The sepia works really well on the silver. It kind of creates this really sort of dirty, rustic kind of effect, which is great. That's kind of what we want. But as I say, it works particularly well on the brass. It also looks really good across these sort of like beaten up cloth bits, you know, the bandages going around his legs. So just showing you here how much I'm covering lots of different areas of the miniature. This is a good way, as I said, to tie the details together. And as you can see, I made a slight mistake there, and the wash just went onto his leg, so I stopped the video there and I've tidied that back up. And we're going back and we're going to rebuild all of those details. Now that that wash has settled and it has dried in the recessed areas, this now gives us the opportunity to rebuild all of those colours. So we're going to start by rebuilding all of those greens, and we go into the warpstone pipes first. We're going to use the sick green. I'm just going to pick out a little area of the warpstone heart, the bit that's sticking out of his chest. You're just going to try and pick out the areas that are sticking out the most. And for the warpstone ball and chain, now for this I've got a little bit of a different kind of effect for you. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pick out the very edges, like so, and be very careful with the very tip of your brush. What we're going to do then is, using the very tip of our brush, we're just going to drag a few very thin straight lines across, like so. And this is going to create sort of like a crystallized element. So really cool effect. It looks amazing. Goes really well with this miniature as well. As you see, I'm just gently going to drag that brush up, so just the very tip like that. See, it doesn't have to be exact, doesn't have to be a straight line, but we just build in these lines. And as I say, this is creating an element of like a crystal effect. And we're going to build this up with multiple layers, like we did with the skin. We're going to build highlights and highlights and highlights and highlights, and this is going to keep on building. So going from there, I'm using a sick green, like I said, as the original, but this time I've mixed in about 50% of the scorpion green as well. Now, scorpion green is very similar to Citadel's moot green, so it's a very bright green. This is great because when you mix this in with the sick green, as I was saying about getting those blends to work quite nicely so that they look a little bit more natural, this is going to be a nice natural highlight to that sick green, and it's going to allow us to build that up gradually as we go along. So we're doing the pipes and the heart, and once again we're going back down to the crystal ball. So like I say, just using the very tip, look, just using the very edge of your brush, just going to go across the very specific edges here, like so. And then we're also going to do what we did with the original colour of sick green, and just using this to build a few of these straight lines. So very gently. Don't need to be too extreme, don't need to be too thick. You want them to be nice and thin lines. And you can do these both ways. They don't have to go in one direction. You can use them in two directions. You can use them in the center. You can use them in the edges. And we build in those crystallized effects, as you can see, bit by bit by bit. And the more layers you add, the deeper this crystal looks. And it creates a really cool effect. This is brilliant for warpstone types of things, especially something like this. go, you see, just gently pulling the edge of your brush across. So now that we've done that, we're going for the specific straight highlight now of Scorpion Green. We're just using that now just around the pipes, just across the top edges more than anything, just so that we can see where kind of like the light is hitting, and so that they're brighter across the top, darker across the bottom. And this is creating more of a lighter, more luminous, more sort of like otherworldly kind of colour. I'm using this highlight as well just on the very edges of the crystals that are sticking out of his arm, because on his left arm he does have quite a few crystals protruding, just like so. And once again we're going to go and do the crystals, so just showing you on the very edge of the crystal here just how I'm building this colour up again. So building across, just like so, and then using that very tip of the brush, the very thin edge of the brush, just building up some more of those lines like so. And look at that effect so far. I mean, that is looking really nice. That's a great effect for sort of crystals and, like I say, otherworldly sort of like green warp stone and things like that. It's starting to look really good. The more colours that you add to this, the more highlights you add to it, the more depth you get out of this sort of crystal effect as well. So considering we used a wash on that, and then we haven't really painted it out of the wash, we're using that wash for the darker bits, and then we're just using highlights after highlights to create these sorts of crystal lines going through it, and it looks really good. It's a really cool effect. It takes a little bit of concentration, so be careful. So as I was saying earlier about using white ink to boost colour, we've gone for the Scorpion Green, which is a really bright colour anyway. And now what I'm doing, I'm just adding a little bit of that titanium white into the Scorpion Green, which is going to create a very sort of light, bright, luminous sort of colour. And with this one, what I'm doing is I'm just dabbing this one on. So I'm dabbing this one to make it look a little bit more organic. So this isn't going to be like a smooth sort of transition. This one's going to be dabbed on almost as if like the light is catching the tubes. So it's creating a little bit more of a light source and a little bit more of a light effect around that. I'm also just going to catch the very tips, the very edge of the highlighted points on the rest of the crystals on the warpstone. So just a little bit in the chest here. Again, on the left arm where the crystals are protruding from his arm as well, and once more for a final stage on the crystal as well. As you can see, the crystal looks really nice now that we've added that final highlight. Now with the silver, I'm going to do quite an easy sort of effect for the silver. I'm just going to use a very light dry brush. For this one I'm using a plate mail metal from the Army Painter. You can use sort of any kind of sort of a lighter silver to what we were using. So I used the gunmetal to begin, so that would have been like a citadel, sort of like a lead belcher, I guess, and then you just build that up from there. So I'm using this plate mail metal. The Army Painter metallics have quite good pigmentation in them. They tend to be quite bright, so this is why I use them for this. So once I've done with the dry brushing, I'm also then using the very tip of my brush just along some of the very sort of detailed areas of the silver, as you see, just across the pipe, just across that scouter area, across his eye as well. So yeah, just building the colour back up, leaving the shaded point in the darker areas, and just using the plate mail metal to build that highlight across. I mean, you can use an edge highlight as well on top of that, just across the very tops if you like. If edge highlighting is your thing, that is completely up to you. So going from there, we're going to start to paint up the leathers. For the leathers, I'm using a leather brown colour. This is a much lighter brown. This is more of a, well, as it says, like a leather brown. So this is going to make the colour look completely different to the fur. And what I'm doing, I'm just trying to use the edge of the brush to make sort of like scratchy kind of brush strokes, because when this dries down, we don't want it to dry flat. We want it to look sort of beaten, weathered and old. So I'm using sort of crisscross scratchy tones going across the leathers, and once that dries down as well, that's going to look really good, because it'll make the leather look more weathered and more beaten, because you don't want leathers to look really good, especially not on a guy as grungy and as nasty looking as this. This guy is pretty rough, so we want him to stay looking pretty rough. And this is an optional sort of thing. what I'm doing here is I'm just using the Beastie Brown that we used originally, and I'm using that with a slight mixture of bone white just to highlight it slightly. And what I'm going to try and do now is I'm just going to catch the very edges of the fur just to give it a bit more depth than what I've got. Just using this to catch the very tips of the fur, just so that it kind of highlights it a little bit. And then I'm going to tie that colour back in with a very subtle shade again. And it's just about sort of building that tone, because at the moment I feel like the fur's a little bit flat, so by doing this it's going to create a little bit more to look at. The miniature's going to look a lot better and things like that. I mean, this area, this part is completely up to you if you wanted to do this or not. It is quite time consuming, but I did it just because I wanted the fur to kind of look a little bit more, a little bit deeper. I wanted a bit more contrast over the fur. So as I say, I'm just putting a little bit of strong tone across the top here, which will tie the highlight and the darker colour together. You can see that I've just done that up here as well, across the fur under his chin and things like that. So as I say, when you're painting up underneath, just try to be careful. His arms do get in the way a little. He's quite difficult to get into some of those areas just under and around his chest and around his abdomen. So just try to be as careful as possible. So once we've done that, I'm going back with yet another dry brush. This time I'm using a shining silver, so this is a highlight type of silver. I'm just using the dry brush again, just across the chain, a little bit of his metal arm, a little bit of his leg, and a little bit of his pauldron as well. Now if you get any of this silver onto that brass, you can just go back in with the brass and just tidy that back up, because the brass is such a good sort of standout colour. It'll help to highlight, and it will make it look really nice in the tone as well, so it'll look just about where you want it to be anyway. You don't need to do too much to the brass is pretty much there anyway. It looks great as it is, you know. So once we're there, we're just going back to that bone white, and I'm just going to add the bone white to the teeth first. The teeth are quite small, quite difficult to get to. Front teeth are quite good because they are practically just two big gnashes, two big rat fangs right in the front, which is great. But once you've done those, some of the teeth across the side, you just got to be very careful and use just the very edge, the very tip of your brush, just to try to catch a little bit of the highlight in here, just like this. If you do make a little bit of a mistake, don't worry too much. A tiny drop of water will allow you to fix your mistakes anyway. But as you can see, just trying to catch just the very edge there. Using that bone white as well, just going to go back across the bandages that we've covered. I'm just leaving a little bit of tone and texture there, so as you can see, a little bit down the middle, so that it creates a bit more depth. Makes the bandages look a little bit more brown and dirty and rough, and as I said earlier, a little bit grungy as well, which is kind of what we want, because we want him to be a really sort of like dirty rat, you know. So yeah, you kind of tone it out from the sides and go into the middle if you need. We're going to do the same thing with the bone white as well, just across these tusks. Now the tusks, they've already kind of given you a little bit of a detailed area to kind of work from. So what we're going to do is we're going to build the tusks up by painting along the ridges. So then that leaves the wash sat in the grooves, and it is as simple as that. Which is great really, because normally if a tusk is just quite flat, you've got to kind of build up these grooves yourself. But on this miniature, they've been kind enough to build the grooves into the miniature for you, so you can build this tone and build this highlight going through the tusk quite simply and quite easily. And bone white is a perfect colour for that, as a nice cream sort of base. So just building the colours back up as we've been doing, going back to that red that we used originally, a nice thin coat of this red. Just going to paint this on the very highlights, on the very edges, on the very areas that we're on, leaving that shade again down into that recess point. That sepia looks good on red as well, surprisingly enough. Just be careful not to catch any of the red on his foot. As you see, I caught a couple of times. It's easily fixed though, because we're using thin layers, thin paints. And once that's dry, you just want to highlight that with a lighter red. Now for this one I'm using a bloody red. Bloody red goes really well on the base red from Vallejo. I don't know why, it just seems to have a really nice way of like standing off the base colour. So this is my go-to sort of red kind of highlight then for the base colour. And bloody red does really make it pop. It does stand out quite a lot. It's quite a nice bright colour. Again, just try to be careful not to get any of the red across any of the skin or on his foot or anything like that. And as you see, the miniature is really building now. We're really building this up. So going back to the original colour that we used on his tail, that burnt red. So what we're doing now is just kind of catching the ridges of the tail, but trying our best not to let the red sit into the recesses where the shade is. And this is going to create those sort of bumps and ridges in the tail, like so. And by doing so, we'll give a little bit more detail to the miniature, a little bit more detail to the tail and things like that. You kind of got to make it up a little bit as you go along, because a little bit further across the tail it does lose a slight bit of detail. I don't know whether that's my sculpt or if it's just a generic thing across the range, but you can kind of make it up as you go along and kind of create your own ridges anyway, so it makes a cool effect and a cool tone. Now my favourite go-to sort of highlight from the bone white, a lot of people might go straight down to white. You don't want to just go straight to white. My favourite highlight from bone white is actually Elfic Flesh, because this again is still quite creamy, but it is quite light as well. It's a really sort of creamy white, so this is a much lighter highlight. So just going across using that Elfic Flesh just to cover the bone areas, the teeth, the tusks and all of these different bits. And then I think that's pretty much it. The final stage then is just going across those stitches that we said earlier. So when we mentioned the stitches right at the beginning, we're just going to cross those stitches with a dead white. Now dead white is a slight off-white, it's quite bright, and this will allow those stitches to really stand off the skin tone that we've done, which is great because that's what we want. We don't want them to blend in, we don't want them to be the same colour, we want them to really stand out. So by using the bone white originally on the stitches, this will allow then the dead white to do its job and make it pop. And once he's all done, that is it. So as you can see with some of the boils, I've used the purple tone just with a little bit of water and just put a little splodge of the wash on there. You can see how well the scratches have come out now on his belt. You can see what I mean by the brassy brass with that shade on top. You don't really need to do a lot. And also, how cool does that crystal and the warpstone look now that we've built those colours up? As always, my friends, thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you very much for watching.